Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Brookings India. I'm Shamika Ravi, Research Director at the institution and an economist. I'm very happy to welcome you to the development seminar of this month on Is Inflation Dead? And our speaker today is Surjit Bhalla, who's member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council and also the chairman of Oxus Research Investments. And Sajid Chinoy is our discussant for the day. Sajid is the chief economist at JP Morgan. And we will start with Surjit making a presentation which is based on your book, which most of us have had a chance to go over in some detail, though Sajid has probably stayed up all night reading the book in great detail. So let's start with you, Surjit. You have 40 minutes to make the presentation, and then Sajid will continue. Please, the floor is yours. Come.
Thank you very much, Shamika, and it's a real pleasure to be here to present. Basically, it's what I'm going to present on inflation is based on Chapter 7 in my book, the New Wealth of Nations, and with an added discussion about inflation in India. I figured that with Sajid here, I better do something in that regard. Okay, so before I start, just to put things in perspective, that when I went to graduate school, which was a long time ago in the early 1970s, 2% inflation was considered frictional. So anything above that was genuine inflation, but 2% inflation was considered frictional. So now let's just see what the world has had in store for us for the last inflation in the US has averaged 1.9% between 1996 and 2009, and 70 basis points lower over the next 8 years. Okay? So 2% was frictional inflation. Starting 96, the US averaged 1.9, and further down the line has averaged 1.2. A little appreciative inflation fact is that the mean inflation rate in the 21 advanced countries, excluding the US, has averaged almost systematically 25 to 40 basis points less than the US. So we all preoccupied, JP Morgan, all the rest of it, with US inflation. Well, European inflation, Japanese inflation has also been less than this. So in other words, what we're looking at is an inflation rate of somewhere around 1.5% for now close to 20 years. Okay? And I'll come to what is happening in India a little way down the line. Then I show this in the charts. Now let's look at the only point there to note is that the inflation decline set in well prior to 2007. Most of the conventional wisdoms, 2007, 2008, we had the financial crisis, and the world started in 2008 with low inflation, et cetera, et cetera. Not true. Okay. Now, this just shows in a chart fashion, this and the next chart, as to what has been happening to inflation in the advanced economies, that's a blue line, and the emerging economies, that's a red line. And I'll come a little bit further down the line. Most of the data that I present, since it is for continents or large sets of countries, is the median inflation. This is, and if you do it by mean inflation, taking out the outliers, what is called the trim mean, et cetera, you get pretty much the same results. Very much the same results. Okay. This one is just to show from 1996 as to what is happening. And look at that. The 2% frictional inflation was only exceeded once and somewhere down by marginally in 2000 and must have been 2008, and after that has been declining. Okay. Another surprising fact, once you start looking at the data, is that oil prices do not have much of an impact on inflation. And very simply, and I think it's easier for me to read down here, that in the 7 years, 1973 to 1980, oil prices went up by a factor of 10. And you know, much of what our thinking about oil price and inflation is really based on the inflation in the 1970s. And we are like the Germans, you know, they still remember the Weimar Republic, hyperinflation, therefore every year from 1920 onwards is like 1920. That's the thinking on oil prices. That finished. It certainly had an impact. It had a big impact on inflation around the world. But after that, just look at this. In the last 10 years, 98 to 2008, oil prices went up by a factor of 7, from 14.4 to over 100 a barrel in 2008, and a peak of $140 in 2008. What happened to inflation? As we just saw, inflation went down. Here, let's just see in a graphical form what has been happening. This just shows established by the, look at that. And there you have the green line, and this is price of Brent crude, you can do whatever. That goes way, way up, and inflation, whether you look at the US or whether you look at the advanced economies, as I said, I'll come to the developing economies later, you get a systematic decline. So here we have a a huge, almost unparalleled increase in the price of oil, and what we find is overall inflation going down. Not core inflation, I'm talking about overall inflation going down. Okay. So what is happening? So therefore, my attempt is to explain what is happening with inflation. Why is inflation so low and persistently low? As you know, the US, the Germans, the Europeans, the ECB, they're all bending over backwards, nudging each other. We've got to get inflation back up, and have not been successful. There has been discussion post-2008 as to how velocity of money has really declined, and maybe now we'll get back to normal. As I indicated earlier, this thing has been going on well before 2007, so that cannot possibly be an explanation. Okay. Let me go. Okay. So what have been, and I'll just go to one other graph, which is as I promised. There's the median gap. This is the gap between the median inflation in developing economies, and developing economies basically all economies outside of the advanced economies. So it includes Russia and Eastern Europe and whatever, and it's 170 countries or thereabouts, and for the advanced economies it's about 23 countries. So here you have the gap. So I take the gap in the inflation in the developed world and the developing world, and that is now very close to a historical low of 200 basis points and going down lower. Obviously, India is part of that emerging economies, and as I said, I will come to the great Indian inflation story in a little while. But here to note, this is everywhere in the world, except perhaps in India for the time period 2006 to 2014. So what are the explanations? Now let's come to the explanations for the great inflation slowdown. One very popular one is that fiscal deficits cause inflation. Okay? So if you have high fiscal deficits, you get inflation. Well, basically, the fiscal deficit of a country provides absolutely zero clues, and I want to emphasize zero, about the likelihood or the magnitude of inflation. Second, and how do we know that? Well, in the great inflation slowdown, starting from 96, and it doesn't really matter if you take the data going as far back as possible, fiscal deficit just never appeared. So I hope that Surjit will illuminate to us as to why in the market especially, and amongst economists in general, the first thing that comes to their mind is fiscal deficit. Now look, I'm as much against fiscal deficits, almost as much against fiscal deficit as Surjit is, okay? But the point is, and I'm against because it's a very, basically fiscal deficits are politically motivated, there are bad things in there. That's why you want to get the fiscal deficit down, to improve the efficiency of the economy, but not to affect the inflation rate, because empirically, conceptually, etc., the fiscal deficits have precious little to do with it. So going back to the 96-2007 period, world GDP growth. What about the output gap? You know, the famous output gap, Keynesian, blah, blah, blah. The output gap must explain inflation. Well, it turns out that between 96 and 2007, you had the highest growth rate that the world has seen. Okay? And what happened to inflation? As we said, it goes down. So it can't be the case that the output gap, the old Keynesian output gap, has anything to do with the inflation slowdown. Demography, and I'll come to that in a minute, that demography, as explained by the dependency ratio, and this has garnered some support, and you do find, if you will, some empirical evidence, which I will discuss very shortly, that if you take the dependency ratio, you do get a relationship between the dependency ratio as well as inflation. So the fact that the dependency ratio is going down, you get the inflation going down. So there is some support for that. And matter of fact, it's the only empirical piece of work that shows that inflation explains part of the decline in inflation. So let's now look at, and as I said, each 1 point decline, and yeah, there's a significant, each 1 point decline in the dependency ratio leads to a 12 to 25 basis point decline in inflation. Now, so this is the state of the world so far. Let me just summarize. We have that inflation has been declining systematically across the world, and especially in the advanced economies, but not excluding the rest of the world. So it's a global phenomena. And there aren't too many explanations, and the only explanation that does fit with this decline is the demographic one. Is there anything else? So in the course of my book, The New Wealth of Nations, I stumbled upon, if you will, and this has been partly a result of my own experience, and I think of many of us over here who were educated overseas. You come back, your salary is a lot lower here than it is for the same PhD person, or the same college graduate, etc. Your salary in the US would be about 4 times higher than your salary over here in dollar terms. Okay? So therefore, unless you believe that as soon as you come down over here, your productivity goes down, and in the olden days it did go down, you didn't have air conditioning, it broke down, etc. But really, your productivity remains the same. So if you will, I looked at my own personal experience, plus everybody else I knew, on wages. And remember, inflation is really about wage inflation. That's core inflation, and I'll come to that in a minute. And a lot of the empirical studies throughout the last 30, 40 years, including the famous Phillips curve, was done in terms of wages. So I started to look at what explains wage growth or the rate of wage growth in the Western world. And the variable, and this again, going back to trying to capture the great expansion the great expansion in education that has happened. The variable that I have used to capture the phenomena of the huge increase in the supply of college graduates in the world over the last 20, 30 years. And just to give you an idea that the supply of college graduates in the rest of the world was equal to the supply of college graduates in the Western world in 1996, 93 actually. Today, the supply of college graduates in the rest of the world is more than twice that coming out from the Western world. So you've got a huge expansion of workers, educated workers, skilled workers. And one way to appreciate this, remember in the US, these are the following 2 or 3 broad facts that you need to keep in mind. In the US, starting about 1980, if you look at the real wages of those who only have a high school degree, the real wages of those people has come down by about 10%. So the real wage of a high school graduate in the US today is 10% lower than it was in 1980. The real wage of somebody who attended college, but did not graduate, has stayed constant. The college graduates, so therefore there's been an explosion of research in the US to explain the college wage premium, which did not exist prior to 1980, but post 1980, the real wage of college graduates has been going up by about, in the first 10, 15 years, by about 1% per annum, and in the last 20 years, about 0.5% per annum. And the rest is, if you will, staying constant. That's the premium. So in other words, we know there's a premium in terms of how much they are getting more than the others. This is your human capital model. If you've got the same rate of return to education, etc., then you would find that the college graduates will earn more than the others, but that premium will not be going up through time, will not be changing over time. But this is what we have now. So therefore, the attention in the US, in terms of various articles, has been on explaining the college wage premium. What I have, and so in this equation, I try and, in this, if you will, slide, I explain how does the demographic variable, as I said, the demographic variable explains part of the explanation, is part of the explanation. The supply of college graduates is a bigger part of the explanation, and when you see the two together, it turns out that the demographic explanation is no longer valid, statistically valid. So what dominates is the explosion in labor supply of college graduates. Okay. Now, this is, so as I argue in this slide, that it is globalization, stupid. That is the major explanator for the low inflation, low persistent inflation in the developed world, and now we are finding also persistently low inflation in the developing world. And how do I capture it? I capture it by, as I mentioned earlier, by looking at the supply of college graduates. I do not adjust for quality. Okay? This is just plain simple supply, but if the quality, relative qualities are staying constant, and that seems like a reasonable assumption, you will be getting the result that this large increase in supply will have an effect on inflation, on wages, and therefore on inflation. Okay. And this really follows from Arthur Lewis, and the chapter in the book is called When Arthur Lewis Meets Gary Becker. Gary Becker, and you know, this should be of interest to all of us as economists, especially those of us who benefit from education, which is practically all of us, unless you were born very, very rich, is that until 1960, the economics profession did not think that education had any role to play in determining a person's income. That was 1960. Remember, around 1960, 3 books appeared which solidified this impression. First, Arthur Lewis himself, who had argued in the mid-50s rather, classic article, Unlimited Supplies of Unskilled Labor, where he said that the supply of unskilled labor was so large, continuous, that the wage of unskilled labor would be constrained to be at the subsistence level, because if the real wage rose, other people will come into the labor, to the market, and the wage will stay constant. Parallel that with what is happening today. If the real wage of a college worker were to rise, there are all of us over here and in the rest of the world who will come into the labor market, and whether you come into the labor market in your own, or whether you get hired by somebody overseas, or whether you get an H-1 visa, or whether you don't get an H-1 visa, you are affecting your wage, the real wage of college graduates, and that is therefore affecting the inflation. Now we'll look at, so that's the background, and now we'll look at what the empirical results are. Okay, and I'll go to the wage premium first, and then I'll come to the other one. Let's look at this. What we have is first and remember, here one is controlling for a time trend. There is indeed the case that there is a large increase in, as I said, labor supply, there's a large increase in college graduates, and maybe, and the trend decline in inflation, which we observe, and maybe the two are not related at all, just so happened, coincidentally, that they were there. And then we find that, after controlling for any year deviations, and I'll show you some graphs later on, you find a very, very consistent explanation statistically for the number of college graduates in the rest of the world relative to the number of college graduates in the West. So you then have, and each one of them, I'm just trying to look at, this is table 3, where various regressions are given, whether you look at the colleges in the US, the BAs, the bachelors plus the masters, over the high school graduates, that's a college premium. No matter how you look at it, you do find that basically the college graduates, the supply is having a very significant effect. If you go back to the previous table over here, and this is the determinants of the median inflation in advanced economies, and you see in the column 1, basically, after you have dummy variables, with and without dummy, doesn't matter, but you get a very, very high R squared of 0.79. And if you look at the last, where is this? The fiscal deficit one, which is in column 3, not at all significant. The demographic one is significant, and the college graduates one is hugely significant. If you just have the demographic inflation, demographic influence, the R squared is 0.44. If you don't have that and you just have the college supply, you get an R squared 0.79. So basically, this is the dominant influence. And I will now show you what the prediction is in terms from this model as to the college, the ratio of the college wage to the supply. And from 1980 to now, it doesn't matter what year you're in, it's very much on this trend line. And this one is what I call USSL, is the unlimited supplies of skilled labor, and the great inflation decline coming out from that model, which is in table 3, the last column. And this is the predicted inflation in the developed world, and you have actual inflation. And you can see that they track each other. The nonlinearity is also captured very well by the fact. And as I said, in 93 rather, the two were equal, and now it is double. So there's been a huge, huge increase in the supply of college graduates in the rest of the world relative to the Western world. Okay, so summarizing, what we have is that there aren't too many explanations. Indeed, there are none, other than a good old-fashioned Becker-Lewis explanation that it's the unlimited supplies of skilled labor that has happened in the last 20 years, which explains a very, very large fraction of the inflation decline in the West and also in the developing countries. Nobody's immune from the forces of globalization, except possibly India, because India, the first assumption of everybody has been, we are sui generis. India is unique. I remember back in 1986 writing the article called India the Incomparable. So no matter what explanation you came up with, that there would be somebody saying, but in a country like India, but in a country like India. And I would say that time has come for us not to be, but there are still many forces in India that believe that India is unique, even when it comes to something as global as inflation. So what are the common factors? What comes in your mind as to what explains Indian inflation? The output gap, as I mentioned earlier also, oil price inflation, and fiscal deficits. And the latest monetary policy report of the RBI, which just came out in April, has a quarterly model of inflation with the following independent variables: output gap, oil price inflation, the repo rate, rural wage growth, and lagged CPI inflation. Now, this is mentioned in a footnote that this is what the model that the RBI has. And as you know, for the last several years, the RBI itself admitted, or the MPC admitted, I think in June last year, that their inflation model was broke. They didn't know what was happening with inflation, but continued to make their forecasts, and I believe continue to make policy based on their forecasts, which have always been vastly overestimating inflation. Just look at the latest. In February, that's 2 months ago, they came out with the forecast that January to March inflation. So they already had some data to January. They didn't have the official data, but I'm sure your colleagues must have provided them with informal data, or Surjit must have provided them with the data on food, etc. So in February 7th, they say that the inflation January to March will be 5.1, and it's come out to be 4.5. Now, if you miss 60 basis points of inflation for a 3-month period, and you're in the middle of that 3 months, that's got to be unparalleled. So, so they have, as I said, they admitted in June last year that the inflation model was broke. We didn't know what. They had set up a committee to study inflation, etc. And if we are to believe that what is contained in the April monetary policy report of the RBI, that their inflation model, they just give it in a footnote. And then they have, very interestingly, a decomposition of the inflation. Okay, I've got the report with me there. They have a decomposition of the inflation as to how much is caused by food, how much is caused by rural wage growth, and so on and so forth. It turns out that none of the variables, that is the output gap, oil price inflation, repo rate, rural wage growth, are significant at all. The lagged CPI inflation, this is a quarterly model, so it's a Granger-Vaz specification, so which is lagged, you lag all the variables. I won't go into the econometrics, but simple, except for lagged CPI inflation, nothing works. And the lagged CPI inflation is barely significant at the 10% level. This is quarterly data, 2002 onwards, because the repo rate was only introduced in 2002. So, so what explains Indian inflation? So, well, in 2011, when faced with the same problem, I had come up with an explanation in a report that really what explained Indian inflation was procurement prices. The rate of increase in minimum support prices explained Indian inflation. And I have extended that to the present. That was done in 2011 with data until 2008. And I want to get to that model, and which is presented over here. So the dependent variable is a log change in annual inflation. As I said, the quarterly inflation, nothing works. The dependent model is the change in annual inflation. You have the output gap, not significant. You have the consolidated fiscal deficit, not significant. And the dummies are significant. So that the first column is just showing that the two favorite variables, output gap and fiscal deficit, have nothing to do with inflation in India from 1970 to 2017, mind you. And I can tell you how I linked the data on CPI inflation, etc., from the present to the past. So that's your first column, nothing is significant. Okay. Then I introduce the lagged growth in procurement prices. And the procurement prices is a weighted basket, a weighted index of what the procurement price is, and you take the percentage change in that, and you find out that basically that is quite significant, has a significant, whether you look at t-statistic or whatever, and a coefficient of 0.2. And plowman wages are not significant in column 2, but let's look at which is for 1980-93, there are 35 observations. I should put, the next time I'll put, so it's 35 years from the present. And then let's look at what the RBI has done, which is used from 2002 onwards. I go back to 1996, which is when I think the big turnaround in Indian inflation took place. What we forget, and just like I mentioned to you earlier, that the 2% inflation was considered frictional back in 1970. We should not forget that Indian inflation between 96 and 2004, excluding the onion year of 1998, averaged less than 4% a year. So the fact that something went wrong in India starting 2005, 2006 until 2013. Let's look at what went wrong. The average inflation rate in India from, I believe, 2006 or 2007 till 2013 averaged the highest 8-year average in Indian history, even more than the average inflation in the 1970s. Would you
like to correlate that with the high growth that was witnessed during this period?
Yeah.
2005 to 2013?
Yeah, and that's what, precisely the high growth should be captured by the output gap. And what we find is that statistically there's no significance whatsoever of the output gap. So the output gap doesn't explain anything. And same thing like the fiscal deficit, that in the recent monetary policy report, the RBI is not arguing, interestingly enough, that the fiscal deficit has any impact on the CPI, on inflation. What we have, let's take between 96 and 2007, the fiscal deficit continuously went up, okay? The consolidated fiscal deficit, and inflation systematically came down. So empirically, your question is a very good one. There are all these arguments made, but empirically, you don't see anything. So I would be much more assured if empirically you are able to see. And what I show in here is that if you take the procurement prices, so in the final equation, take oil prices, doesn't show any significance. And indeed, there's a recent paper that I cite by Choi et al., it's just January 2018, which looks at in great detail about oil prices affecting inflation across the world. And what they find is that that impact has diminished strongly over time and is almost non-existent now, maybe very small. Okay, so let's look at the final column, where it's from 1996. You can look at, I've given for the various time periods, but you look at the 96 onwards column, which is when we have changed. You know, we had the reforms in 93, 96 onwards, you try and look at what is happening. What you find is that a couple of noteworthy things. Look at the constant term, no longer significant. Look at the R squared. The R squared is 0.89, okay? And what we find, there are two variables that explain it. One is lag procurement prices. So if this year you increase the procurement price, then it feeds into the inflation next year. Second is the wage growth. And here, the wage growth, there are several pieces of rural wage growth that are available. The longest historical data that we have is wages of plowmen, unskilled men. And that also is quite significant. You take the two together, that's what explains most of what is happening.
So 0.136 is not significant, the output gap?
Output gap is not significant at all. The T statistic is 0.8. The coefficient is 0.14 and the standard error is 0.16. Those are standard errors in here. Yeah. So for convenience, basically anything with an asterisk, and 3 asterisk is where this is the Stata output, which puts it out very conveniently for you, so you don't have to do any guessing. But if there are 3 stars, then it's significant at the 1% level. 2 stars at 5% level.
Salaries and wages have increased in the period which you are talking about to a considerable extent. That is cause of the inflation because the purchasing power automatically gets higher. So is that reasoning goes with your saying?
No. Okay. The attempt at explaining inflation is actually through what causes wage inflation. Okay? So that is, if we had, for the US, as I mentioned in the earlier tables, it's wage inflation. But in India, we do not have a series on wage inflation. And the best series on wages that we have is only for rural workers. So therefore, it is very hard, but I think it is wages. Procurement prices feed into wages. And so I think it is wages. And that's what one is trying to explain. So let's look at some of the, so each 1% increase in rural wages leads to a 28 basis point increase in inflation. Each 1% increase in lag procurement prices leads to a 12 basis point increase in inflation. And that impact has, when I did this model with just the procurement prices, lag procurement prices back in 2011, the coefficient was 0.3. And now the coefficient has steadily come down and it's only about 0.12, okay? And as I said, able to explain a very large fraction. And just to show you, and then I will finish, 2 graphs over here. And this is how the fit is of the last equation. Oh, no? What's happening? There. This is the previous model that I showed the inflation. This is the fit. So it's a very, very close fit for actual inflation, both in going way up and in coming way down, that is able to capture and as you can see now, that the red line, which is the fitted inflation, is now about 50, 60 basis points higher for the last 3 years. And that's what I'm saying. It's too early to tell whether the procurement price model is also weakening systematically or not, but clearly the evidence is, and you know, you go back to 1996 and you find this. Then the last graph I want to show is this one. And the red line is median inflation in emerging economies, and that we had discussed earlier. And what we see is that we closely tracked till about 2004-05. Then we went haywire and got a completely distorted picture. We were one of the few countries in the world showing inflation. And we need to go into the political economy of that, and we're happy to do so. But now we're joining the rest of the world again, and which is why I think inflation is not only low today, I mean, let's look at it, the data that just came out. In 2017-18, average inflation in India for those 12 months was 3.5%. And obviously, the RBI thinks it was very, very high. And so we have had persistently 2.5% at least the real rate of interest, or repo policy rate. By comparison, you look at across the world, this is the third highest, and we are very soon going to be the second highest real repo rate, because rates are coming down rapidly in Russia and in Brazil, which are the two countries with a repo rate, real repo rate higher than ours. And we have to ask sometime as to whether a real rate of 2.5% to 3% is justified for an emerging economy, for an economy trying to grow, and what is it achieving in terms of an inflation decline. One last thing before it comes up in the discussions, inflation targeting, which has been the practice in India since 2016. Several studies, and I'm updating them, several studies that have come out over the last 5-6 years show that inflation targeting has had zero impact on inflation declines. So they look at the set of countries that had inflation targeting and look at the set of countries that didn't and do the comparison. These are all published studies, etc., and they do a fair. Last but not least, New Zealand introduced inflation targeting in 1984-85. They have just gotten away from any inflation targeting. So they've forsaken inflation targeting. The country that started it all has now forsaken it. I'll end there. Thank you very much.